This is They Create Worlds, episode 235, Coin-Op Legends of Japan.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again from the shores of Japan as we go to the many shrines that dot the land in honor of all the wonderful game developer company people things that dot the landscape.
Game developer company people things dotting the landscape.
I just make this stuff up off the top of my head, so I don't know how else to put it. Sometimes I know what I'm going to say, sometimes I don't, and it just leads to hilarity, insanity, or just a whole bunch of listeners face-palming. So if you face-palmed to that and many of my other sayings, you may now take another drink.
Indeed.
But of course, you can always enjoy this year's version of doing that live, because we finally decided, A, what we're going to talk about, and B, roughly when we're going to talk about it when we do our yearly live stream.
That's right, as longtime listeners know, once a year, because the internet couldn't survive more than that, we sit down for a full day in front of actual cameras and do actual live recording of a 3-part episode, while our most dedicated fans stay a while or perhaps even stay forever. We will be continuing that tradition this October, exact date TBD, when we do a 3-part history of Commodore International, the company best known for the Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga, and Jack Business is War Trammell.
But didn't we do an entire thing talking about the computer price wars? And Commodore did feature prominently in that.
Yeah, but that's just like a 5-year period of Commodore's history. We'll be looking at the entire thing from the founding of the predecessor company in the 50s all the way up until the end of the company in the early 90s.
Oh, the complete thing, not just the price wars.
Indeed. So it's a nice sequel to our 3-parter a couple years back on the computer price wars that we also did as a stream. Pulling up and out a little bit and just following Commodore through its many, many ups and downs, or its few ups and many downs, one might say.
So you definitely have that to look forward to, but also you're going to look forward to another thing that is starting to become a tradition here at They Create Worlds, and that is Alex and I talking for under an hour at DragonCon.
That's right. We still hope one of these days to expand to another convention here or there like the Midwest Gaming Classic, but for the moment, I am just continuing to use any excuse I can to drag people down to DragonCon, my favorite con, where I'd be going anyway, whether They Create Worlds was a part of it or not. We are once again going to be giving a video game history talk there, exact day to be determined, on the arrival of the Famicom in North America in 1985 as the NES in that limited test market. Once again, longtime listeners will know that we have already done an episode on this, so unlike the last couple that we've done at DragonCon, this won't be a truncated version of a new episode coming out, but it is the 40th anniversary this year of that auspicious event, and so that seemed like a pretty good thing to do at the convention.
Definitely, and it's hard to imagine that we've been doing this for 10 years. We started in September 1st, 2015.
That's right. So right at the end of DragonCon, by coincidence, will be the official 10th anniversary of the podcast. Technically, we're past the 10th anniversary of us starting to figure out what this thing is, as we started that in about April of this year. But the first episode went live September the 1st, 2015. So we're going to have that 10-year anniversary episode coming up. We'll mark it in some way, for sure.
Well, we at least know 10 years of something. We'll talk about it, but that's all the insanity that we know about for that.
Indeed.
Why don't we get what the people came here for, Alex, and talk about founders and video game companies and coin-op companies all over Japan. All those ones we don't really get to hear about because we just don't have enough information to talk about them for, 2 hours. So they're going to get their moment in the sun with 30 minutes.
Something like that. Exactly, though. We have done episodes on a couple of Japanese companies. We've done Namco, we've done Konami, we've done Taito, and of course the console companies like your Nintendos and your Segas. There's always plenty of things to talk about, so we've done a bajillion episodes on them. There is a problem that we run into with the format of this podcast in doing as much history of a lot of the important Japanese companies as I would really like to do. We do in-depth histories. We do deep dives on topics. We try to present material that, even if it's not unique to us, because certainly not everything we do is unique to us, we're at least trying to put our own spin on it and interject our own inside jokes throughout it to provide you, the listener, a good time. While there are a lot of individual Japanese games that we have enough information on that we can certainly do that, games or series, as we've done with Donkey Kong, the games of Yu Suzuki, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, etc., it's harder to cover the entire sweep of a lot of these Japanese companies because there's just not a lot of information. We could talk just a little bit about the founding and then be like, and then they released this game, and then they released this game, and then they were on this platform, and then this person took over the company. But it would be very surface level for most of that material. So it tends to be better for us to focus on individual systems or individual games or individual series, with a few exceptions like Konami and Koei, where we were able to go into just a little bit of depth. And as we can, we'll continue to do that in the future as well, of course. But I do have a lot of information that I've gathered, mostly from Japanese sources, now that machine translation has opened that up so much more to non-speakers. I do have more information than I've ever had on the founding of some of these companies, information on the founders, why they got into the business, the early years. For most companies, there's not enough there to sustain an entire episode of the length that we do. We never want to be under an hour. Occasionally, we're just over an hour. More often, we're 90 minutes to 2 hours. Occasionally, there's more insanity than that. But if there were insanity like that too often, we would not have made it 10 years because Jeffrey would have gone insane after year 2.
Who says I'm insane now?
Well, more insane. I've known him since the 3rd grade. He wasn't sane then. He's not sane now, but I would hate to see Jeffrey completely untethered by reality, and having to edit 3-hour episodes of They Create Worlds twice a month would probably bring us there.
I mean, it does take me a long time.
Indeed. There's a lot of company founding information that I have for some of these companies that don't really fit into an episode. Plus, of course, as we always like to say on They Create Worlds, for something that has already happened, history sure does change a lot. And in some cases, I've even come up with additional information that I didn't have after we covered a company like, say, Konami, which, in fact, uncovering new information about the founder was kind of my inspiration for this episode, because I wanted to get that information in somehow, but we already did Konami as a topic, so there wasn't a good way to do it. Yeah, we're going to take a few of the big founders of Japanese coin-op companies, and we're going to take a look at them. Some of it will be a little bit of retread material from other episodes, if it's a company we've already touched on, like Namco or Konami. Some of it is already found in my book, where I profiled some of these companies. Some of it is brand new to this episode and is appearing in an English retrospective like this for pretty much the first time. So there'll be a mix there. But of course, we'll put our usual They Create Worlds spin on all of it. One thing we will not do is we will not rehash the histories of Sega or Taito, because I'm really focusing on the Japanese founders. As we know, those companies were founded by foreigners. We're also not going to really pay too much attention to Nintendo, because we've done Nintendo in depth. I think I might sneak a little something in that, again, is something a little different, additional information that I didn't have before, but we're not going to dwell there because we've done Nintendo to death as well. But yeah, we're going to take a look at a few of these founders and the beginnings of their companies, of these coin-op legends, because I believe every company we're covering will have started in coin-op, though obviously many of them expanded into the home after that.
Who do we start with to begin with? Do we start with an old familiar face, like Konami? Or do we just delve into the unknown?
Well, I want to put this in a little bit of a chronological order, not in chronological order by founding date, but chronological order in terms of the expansion of the Japanese industry. We did do an episode on the coin-op industry in Japan. It's a very early episode of the podcast. I think all the way back in year 1 even, but very early regardless. A lot of it still holds up. Again, we're not rehashing that. It does make sense to kind of move through that chronology a little bit and see how these people are slowly being drawn into this business. Because there really wasn't, after World War II, much of a native Japanese coin-op industry. There was a little bit. There were a couple of people, who we're not talking about today, like the legendary Kaiichi Endo, who had businesses before World War II and were able to slowly rebuild said businesses after World War II. What coin-op industry had existed prior to the war was just completely wiped out by the combination of bans on games and establishments by the Imperial Japanese government as distractions from the war effort, and then, of course, just the massive devastation and destruction across the Japanese islands due to the war itself. As we talked about in our other episodes, whether they be the episodes on Japanese arcades generally or on Sega and Taito specifically, the reestablishment of a Japanese coin-op industry was actually largely started by outsiders. Most of them American, most of them Jewish, many of them American Jewish, though not all of them American Jewish. Entrepreneurs who leveraged connections through the United States military or leveraged connections with Jewish diaspora communities within East Asia that had come into being primarily as a consequence of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War back in the late teens and 1920s. Leveraged those connections to come in and primarily service U.S. military establishments or take equipment from U.S. military establishments, usually used, and then refurbish it and put it on the Japanese market. For more on that kind of behavior, I would particularly check out our episodes on the early history of Sega and on the history of Taito, where you can get a lot of that information in more depth. By the 1950s, there weren't a lot of avenues for these games yet in Japan. There was a jukebox business that was beginning to develop. Pachinko was back in a big way. But pachinko's always been something that, while very much linked with the Japanese coin-op industry, has also been somewhat distinct from it, much in the same way that in the United States, the slot machine industry is also a coin-operated industry, but has always been in some way a little bit distinct from the amusement industry because of the gambling elements involved. In this very early period, it was mostly jukebox people, it was mostly pachinko people, and it was not a lot of coin-operated amusement people, but it was starting to come back in, and it was coming back in primarily through, initially, rooftop gardens on department stores, because, of course, in Japan, space is always at a premium. So even before the war, it was customary that the roofs of department stores would often be places for amusements. There would be small rides there. There would be games there. I'm sure there'd be some stuff for the parents as well, but they would turn these rooftops into amusement spaces because people were coming anyway. And, you know, you're dragging your kids around and sometimes your kids just need a break. So why not have a rooftop space? So that's really how our first entrepreneur that we're going to talk about got involved, was through these rooftop spaces that were just coming back in the 1950s. And that, of course, is Masaya Nakamura of Namco. Now, he is a familiar face. I'm not sure that there'll be too much here that is new from when we covered Namco way back in the day. But it's still the logical starting place because he was really the oldest of this new wave, not counting the rare pre-war person, the oldest of this new wave to get involved. The theme that we're going to see with everybody here is that they're all coming from other industries. Many of them have some engineering understanding, especially in the early days, though not all of them do. But they either come from a retail background or some kind of engineering background and are parlaying that into seizing these new opportunities that are becoming available. Masaya Nakamura, he was born in 1925, giving an idea of age here. His father, Yutaru, had a business before the war as a manufacturer of handcrafted shotguns. So he's a craftsman. Of course, World War II destroyed his business, as it destroyed so many people's businesses. He didn't get back into manufacturing after that, but he did move into gun repair. He opened a gun repair shop in the Matsuya department store in Asakusa in Tokyo.
How did that work with Japan outlawing guns, especially for the population, if he's repairing guns and shotguns and whatnot?
Well, it's not going to work out well as time goes on, because those regulations are going to start coming in, and they're going to start becoming more and more stringent as time goes on. So, yeah, short answer, not well. Long answer, stay tuned. Masaya Nakamura did help out his father in the store some, but he really was drawn to the sea and wanted to be a sailor. That was his ambition. Unfortunately, he had very, very, very poor eyesight. Very poor. I don't know how poor. I mean, he wears glasses. I know that. I wore glasses. He died a few years back. According to him, poor enough vision that he was never going to make it as a sailor. He did the next best thing. He comes from a craftsman family. He has some aptitude there. So he decides instead that he is going to study shipbuilding at Yokohama State University. If he can't be on the sea, at least he can build things going on the sea, I suppose is the logic there. He graduated in 1948. So not long after the war and kind of before Japan's economic miracle had started. So wouldn't you know, they didn't exactly have jobs in shipbuilding at that time in 1948 when people in Japan were just trying to survive and figure out how basic necessities worked again.
You would think you would want some boats because Japan does have a vibrant fishing industry. So fish, food, people live, boats.
Yeah, but you don't need a lot of engineers to build whatever they were needing at that time. So he was unable to find a job. So he returned to his father's store and basically did any odd jobs. He helped run the place. He managed the books, so he was getting some experience there that would be valuable to an entrepreneur. He designed the advertising posters and would bicycle around to hang them up around the city. He'd sweep the floors. He basically did everything that his father needed him to do. At first, the business was doing okay. They had started out by just repairing old rifles because, of course, scavenging what was left and trying to just make do with old stuff is really what Japan had to do at the beginning as they were getting back on their feet. Then they moved to selling new air guns, which were still not fully restricted at this time. So that was something that they could sell new things, air guns. But there were restrictions coming. As time went on, there were more and more restrictions being put on guns and even less destructive types of guns like air guns. That's what kind of led them for the first time in the direction of the toy business. Because as that air gun thing was drying up, Masaya started modifying some of the air guns they had for sale as toys, which is what got him thinking about children's entertainment. He didn't really feel like there was a long-term viability for this gun business, and he alighted on children's entertainment as something that could move them forward. Of course, being in a department store, he was also very aware of department store amusement spaces. And in fact, his father had even created pop guns for rooftop amusement installations before the war. He had actually worked with Kaiichi Endo, one of the pioneers of the Japanese coin-op industry, before the war. So they had some familiarity with that space. So Masaya Nakamura, moving on from this thing of making these toy guns, thought it would be great to go and take some of this rooftop department store business as well. His father was less enamored with it, didn't think it was a good idea. Masaya went off and formed the Nakamura Manufacturing Company in June 1955 to operate rooftop amusement spaces. He did have a problem at first because there weren't that many spaces. I mean, we're still early in the Japanese economic miracle. What spaces there are, though, have already kind of been taken over. He has a couple of refurbished secondhand horse rides. He refurbishes them himself. So he ends up on the roof of a Matsuya department store. It wouldn't surprise me because his father's business was in a Matsuya store, but it was in a different Matsuya store. It wouldn't surprise me if he leveraged contacts through Matsuya to finally find a place, but the only location he could get was a Matsuya store in Yokohama. a neighboring city on Tokyo Bay, neighboring Tokyo. It's still a sizable city, but it's not exactly the heart of the Japanese amusement industry. But nevertheless, he put his rocking horse rides there. He would maintain them himself, clean them himself, polish them up. He would greet customers. He had only 2 employees at the very start. So, he was working this thing. He was working them horsies. Over the next few years, he was able to add a few other small locations. And then his big breakthrough came in 1963 when one of Japan's premier department store chains, Mitsukoshi, contracted him to build a rooftop amusement space for their flagship location in Nihonbashi in Tokyo. So he built a big thing there. He had the horse rides, he had 3D sound and picture viewing machines, there was a pond for goldfish scooping, and he created an elaborate amusement park ride called the Roadway Ride that kids could ride around in as well. Based on the strength of that location, which went very well, he was able to expand to other Mitsukoshi stores, and that was kind of his break into the big time. We won't go detailed from there because we have done a Namco history before. Of course, by this time, he's buying a lot of machines. He's not just refurbishing old horse rides himself. He's buying a lot of machines to support his department store trade. Because he's buying a lot of machines, he's able to buy in bulk at a discount. So he gets the idea that, well, if I can buy in bulk from a discount, I can essentially become a distributor. Because I can buy machines cheaper than smaller operators of rooftop and other spaces can. Then I can sell them on at a price that those organizations are more accustomed to, but probably still undercutting the factories themselves because it's not his primary business. So they save a little money and he gets to make a profit and move into another area. He starts as this operator, then he becomes a distributor as well as an operator, and then finally in 1966, because by this time the whole coin-op industry is exploding in popularity, the gun corners that Rosen Enterprises and Taito have pioneered are starting to appear in more and more places. Retail is expanding, and retail locations like supermarkets are putting in gun corners as they go, so the demand for machines is rising. He takes the next step and decides that he can actually manufacture his own machines to help fill this increasing demand, which is why in 1966 he owns a factory and moves into manufacturing. Of course, a lot of his machines are marketed under the Namco brand name, short for Nakamura Manufacturing Company, and then in 1977 he officially changes the name of the company to Namco. So he's really part of the real old guard, and he's the only guy amongst these kind of old guard Japanese folk that get into the video game industry. Obviously, Seigo and Taito get into the video game industry, but as we said, they were founded by foreigners. They weren't native Japanese folks. Other companies around this time that got kind of big, like Casco, never really made the transition to video games. So Masaya Nakamura kind of stands alone in this early period as someone who parlayed success in these rooftop department stores into becoming first a distributor and then a manufacturer. I wanted to talk a little bit as well about this growing retail space that I talked about just a second ago in the context of Namco. Because by the 1960s, the so-called Japanese economic miracle is in full swing. The country is becoming very prosperous. Retail is modernizing. You're getting these big spaces like supermarkets, for instance. You're getting more and more department stores, etc. What's going on with supermarkets coming in is actually doing a lot to mess with some of the traditional grocers and food wholesalers in Japan. And it's kind of funny, there are 2 different of these food wholesale / retail folks that end up getting into the coin-operated amusement business as well and becoming very important people. Next, I want to talk about these folks, Hajime Satomi and Kenzo Sugimoto. Hajime Satomi was a bit of a character. His father was a bit unusual compared to the typical Japanese salaryman. It's an unfortunate stereotype to claim that all Japanese people are salarymen and they just go to one company and toil at one company for the rest of their lives until they retire and maybe move up a few steps of middle management, but never go off on their own to be entrepreneurs or start their own businesses. Obviously, it's a bit of a stereotype to say that there are no entrepreneurs in Japan. There are plenty of small business owners and entrepreneurs in Japan, but it's still considered outside of the cultural norm. Hajime's father decided to live outside that cultural norm. He had been a typical salaryman, but at the age of 40, he decided he wanted to strike out on his own, become an entrepreneur, and he established a tofu and konnyaku wholesaler in Tokyo. He passed along this kind of entrepreneurial spirit to Hajime. While he was in college, Hajime decided that he would start his own business too. He wanted to be an entrepreneur, and he didn't want to wait until he was even out of school. In his third year at university, he borrowed money from his parents, and he opened his own bar. I don't know if it was through the bar trade or some other way, but the year after that, he met some people that were involved in coin-operated amusements, which in this time period were expanding in Japan, this being the 1960s, this period that I was talking about. So he ended up establishing a machine sales and leasing company with these people. He served as the representative director. Again, they were serving as middlemen. They were not making their own machines, but they were acquiring machines and then selling them or leasing them to locations or operators to put on location. It didn't go well. The company failed within a year. That really doesn't surprise me. I don't have a lot of details here, and so I could be off base, but we've talked about before how that three-tier distribution system, the manufacturer, the distributor, the operator, really did not exist in Japan because the manufacturers usually ended up being distributors and operators as well, and even though there were some independent operators, the factories were so heavily involved in distribution that distribution wasn't really necessary. All of the major coin-op companies had their own sales offices all over Japan. They didn't go through a middleman. I can imagine that it would be challenging to be in a business that was just a distribution business in Japan for that reason, that you can't really compete with the big boys. I kind of get the feeling that that's what happened here, even though I don't know that for sure, because his response to the company failing was not fleeing from the coin-op business altogether, but was deciding that what he should really be is a manufacturer. So that's why it wouldn't surprise me if his distribution business was basically overwhelmed by the manufacturers, and he's like, that's where the real money is.
I can definitely see how that would make sense, because we've talked about before, largely in Japan, because you don't have all that space.
Yeah.
You don't really need a distributor to do it. A lot of the local manufacturers can get your product throughout the entire country pretty easily overall.
Exactly. Compared to something like the United States, which is so huge, Japan's total land area, which of course is spread across many islands, but the total land area is about the size of California, which is not small, but is not the entirety of the United States of America.
Exactly. I can see where he's coming from here. He goes, hey, I'm trying to set up a distribution thing, buy things, deliver it, make things happen, but I'm not having a lot of success. There's people who are just going like, why do I involve you? You're a middleman. I'm just going to buy direct. I get it on a timely fashion. We don't have a whole lot of these things. Why not?
Exactly. Satomi decides he can do better as a manufacturer. So at this time, I don't know if his father's getting on in age or the food business is not doing well or what, because again, I don't always have all the insights I would love to have on these Japanese businesses. Satomi ends up taking over his father's company, Tokyo Nutrition Foods, that tofu and konnyaku wholesaler, and changes the name of the company to Satomi Company Limited, just their last name, and establishes an amusement manufacturing division of the company. So they're not getting out of their other businesses, but they're changing the name to represent that it's a more generalized business that's not just in food. Then they are going to start doing amusement manufacturing. This is a good time to get into it in 1965 as well, because there's a real boom in amusement machines at this time caused by the explosion of crane games. Taito, I think, really touched it off. It started with some Italian imports, and then Taito moved in from there, and then Sega made some classic models. This was really the beginning of the Japanese digger or crane game industry, and of course those machines are still a cornerstone of Japanese arcades to this day. So there was kind of a new demand for these machines to fill spaces, and of course the operators are expanding into more and more retail spaces as the retail market grows in Japan as well. And so this is kind of dovetailing together very nicely, and Satomi's coming in just at this time when there's a peak in demand. They start by making crane machines. They might have been making other stuff as well, but the crane machines are incredibly successful for them.
With the crane machines, I'm having trouble just deciding how you can have any real variety there, because I don't know about you, but I always just see the same basic crane machine. You have the claw that can move in two directions. You let it go, it goes down, and it very crappily grabs something and then puts it in. What you put in it is very different depending on where your location is. But
I'll stop you there because that's the secret, right? Because it's not the machines, which are all very similar to each other, as you say. It's the prizes. I imagine that that's where the opportunity for variety and to set yourself apart is in your choice of prizes that you put in the machines.
Okay, not so much the design of a claw machine itself or a crane machine, because it seems like all of those are the same. Little young Jeffrey and probably little young Alex went, why is this claw such a poor grabbing device?
Oh, yes. I learned very quickly that the claw machines were not worth my time. But yeah, I certainly did try them out and was like, well, that didn't work well.
I guess the way they can grab must be adjusted, because the one time I won using those things was at E3, and I used one of those claw machines and it was at a promotional booth. They must have changed the claw so that it could actually grab something.
Probably. It wouldn't be such a fun promotion if nobody got anything. And also, I see how you snuck in that reference to that E3 appearance that I am in no way jealous about, Jeffrey. Rest in peace, E3.
Yep.
So, yeah, I imagine prize variety is where you could do that. Because, yeah, the machines themselves were very similar from model to model. Satomi was very successful with cranes in the 60s. Then, of course, there was the new fad that began around 1973, which was the game centers with metal games. We talked about that in our Japanese coin-op episodes before, so we won't talk about it here, but it was basically various types of gambling machines that were like slot machines or roulette machines or horse racing machines or other kind of games of chance type machines. But instead of spending and winning money, gambling money on them, you only won in medals. You still had to spend money to play them, obviously. That's how the places made a profit. But it was an understanding that you were not gambling, that you were just playing for medals that were worthless, and maybe you could exchange them for a prize like tickets at American arcades a few decades from them. And
if you want to experience that yourself, just play just about any casino in the Dragon Quest game.
Exactly. There's a reason you have to change to essentially a different type of currency in order to play those things. Now, of course, some gray market gambling went on because you might take those medals around the corner and exchange them for the real prizes. But the theory was that this was gambling style thrills without the actual gambling, which was illegal in Japan. This kind of became the real craze for a few years in the early 1970s. Sigma, that kind of pioneered this, opened their first location in 1971, but it was really more like 1973 that it started really picking up in popularity, and it maintained popularity for the next few years until the video game craze started coming in, but we'll get there. They were doing the cranes, and then they got into metal games. They started manufacturing in 1973 something called range ball machines, which were kind of a combination of a pachinko machine and the bingo pinballs. So you're trying to arrange the balls in particular patterns to pay out. They marketed these machines under the brand name Sammy. Company is Satomi. The brand name was Sammy, just like Nakamura Manufacturing started using that Namco brand name. Or Service Games started using the Sega brand name. That's a common trend there. There ended up being a major fraud case that I don't have a lot of details on. It had something to do with stadiums. I don't know the full details, but Satomi Company got caught in the periphery of a very bad fraud case and ended up going bankrupt as a result. But Hajime established a new company in 1975, Sammy Industry, to continue the amusement business of Satomi Company going forward. That's, of course, the Sammy Industry that would go on to buy Sega. Still exists today as Sega Sammy. Satomi was the power behind that merger, as we talked about in some of our Sega episodes. They were primarily a metal and pachinko game company. That's what they became most known for, but they were also involved in video games as well for a time. They did arcade games. They had an American branch, American Sammy, that released some games. That is the origin of Sammy and its founder, Hajime Satomi. So I said there were two companies or two entrepreneurs that kind of came out of the food business. One was Hajime Satomi, as we said. The other was Kinzo Tsujimoto. Just like the Satomi family, the Tsujimoto family was involved in the wholesale food business. Kinzo, who was born in 1940, worked in the family business after graduating high school. I don't believe he went to college. But he did study accounting in his spare time, so that might have been college work. But he went to work straight out of high school and was taking accounting classes on the side. In 1966, he left the family business because he saw no future in it. As he put it, it's because the rise of the supermarket, which was part of the retail boom in Japan in the early 1960s, was beginning to really change the food wholesaling business. You'll note that this is 1966, almost the same time that Satomi is changing the direction of his father's wholesale food company away from foodstuffs and into amusements. And so, again, I don't have a lot of a line into these companies, but I would be surprised if that were a coincidence. I wouldn't be surprised if Tokyo Nutrition Foods, which was the name of Satomi Company before Hajime renamed it, I wouldn't be surprised if they were feeling some of those same pressures. Tsujimoto decided to get out of the food wholesaling business and decided to get into confectionery products.
Well, that does make a logical transition. You're going from food to more or less desserts. I mean, same general ballpark.
Exactly. And this was a period when you were starting, I think, to have an influx. You're having the first real generation of children, right, that are coming up within the period of the economic miracle. Children that don't have a memory of World War II or the immediate post-war aftermath when the economy was doing so poorly. There was definitely a trend, which would continue as the bubble economy took shape, of really doting on children, because you had a generation that grew up with the horrors of the war and the post-war reconstruction, who basically wanted their children to have every comfort and every luxury that they could because they got none of them as children. That tends to be a trend anywhere and everywhere in the world. It's human psychology. Parents, if they're not, sociopathic, psychopathic abusers, parents tend to always want their children to have the things that they never had when they were growing up.
I don't know. I think my kids are going to hate me because I'm going to be no electronics that you get to have ad nauseum.
Indeed. There were a lot of retail establishments and manufacturing and whatnot that were starting to cater to children in this period as well. And so there was a proliferation of candy and sweet stores. Moving into the confectionery business, confectionery products business, seemed like a pretty good idea. He wasn't, to my knowledge, selling. He didn't have a candy store himself, but I think he was selling the kind of stuff that went into those kind of stores. For instance, I know that at some point he started selling cotton candy machines. He was selling equipment and products to go into these kinds of locations rather than operating these locations himself. In the late 1960s, with the proliferation of these candy stores in Japan, the pachinko companies, which had primarily been an adult form of amusement because there was lots of gray market gambling associated with it, The pachinko industry was starting to notice that there was this kind of whole new type of retail establishment that was ripe to put machines into, and started developing pachinko machines that were meant for children to play so that they could sell them around to these candy stores. Tsujimoto was very interested in this. Obviously, he's already doing some retailing of electromechanical style equipment. He's already selling cotton candy machines at the very least. I don't know if he's selling other types of machines as well. Always sketchy with the sources here in Japan. But he sees some synergy here. So he decides, since he's already got all of these connections with all of these candy stores because he's selling them products, that it would make sense for him to become an operator of these machines that are now being targeted at these candy stores because he's already got the connections that he needs. So in April 1969, he establishes a company called IPM Trading Company, with the IPM standing for International Play Machines, so that he can start operating coin-operated amusements, particularly in venues for children. The business does well enough that in 1974, he is able to incorporate, and he incorporates the company as IPM Company Limited. Now, IPM has an interesting distinction because in this period of time, by the mid-1970s, there were really a big three in operations in Japan, and those three companies were Taito, Sega, and Namco. Those are the companies that had gotten in early and often, transitioned very quickly out of whatever field they were in into amusement manufacturing, and of course took over operations as well. Rosen Enterprises, which was one of the companies that merged into Sega, had kind of pioneered the idea of opening gun corners. Taito was right behind them in the business. Namco was operating from strength to strength from its rooftop department store business and then moved on from there. So those were really the big three and remained forever after in the video game coin-op era, the big three in Japan. But IPM, to hear Tsujimoto tell it, and I don't have figures, and reliable figures may not even exist, so we have to take Tsujimoto's word for it. He could be exaggerating. In Tsujimoto's own words, he was the fourth largest operator in Japan after the big boys. The way he was able to do that is that he would target smaller companies, smaller factories, smaller producers. I don't even know that all of them were even big factory operations, that would only have a small number of games, that didn't really have the clout to break in when the big boys are controlling everything. So he would go to these people and he would say, I will take your game on the condition that you give it to me exclusively. I have a large network of locations that are not controlled by the big guys, Taito, Sega, Namco. So I am going to buy a large quantity of your games. It will be worth your while to sell your games to me and only me. You will make money. The condition for this is you really do have to sell them only to me. So that's how he built the business at IPM. And as time went on, kind of similar to what Namco realized, he realized at a certain point that, well, I'm buying all of these games from these companies, and they're giving me their whole stock, and I can put them in my locations, but I've got the exclusives, so why not order even more of them, get even more of a bulk discount, and then I can sell on the ones that I don't need to other small operators like me, and then they can place games in their stores as well, or other small operators like he used to be, I suppose I should say, because at this point he's rather large.
Yeah.
So he moves into a distribution business, and he has a niche that works. You know, it's hard to break into distribution with the big factories, but I think he's targeting different locations like candy stores and whatnot that are not the traditional gun corners and rooftop department store spaces. And so he's got a niche that the factories are not going into. So he's making that niche very lucrative. So he becomes a distributor as well as an operator. He's maybe the fourth largest operator in Japan. Like I said, we have to take his word for it, but certainly a very successful operator. And now he's a distributor as well. Then, of course, in 1977, the first video game boom hits Japan. We did an episode where we talked about that. This is the boom for the blockbusting game, games based on Breakout. The demand is so intense here that a lot of companies that were not traditionally manufacturers or not traditionally manufacturers of video games jumped right into the market to help meet that demand. So in 1977, IPM, they're already deep in the business. They're well capitalized. They can take the risk at this point. Turned into a manufacturer by manufacturing a breakout clone called Blockout that, according to Tsujimoto in an interview, sold 35,000 units, which is fantastic. Stayed in the manufacturing business from there ever after. Of course, in 1979, IPM would change its name. If the name IPM doesn't sound very familiar, certainly the name it changed to IREM probably does. So this is the origin of IREM. And then, of course, a few years later, Kinzo Tsujimoto would leave IREM, which got into some financial difficulty after the collapse of the Space Invaders boom and had to sell out to one of its suppliers. Then he had some conflicts with the new owners. He ends up leaving and in 1983 founds Capcom. Kinzo Tsujimoto here, another early pioneer, another one like Hajime coming out of the food business, and is a double pioneer because he founded both IREM and Capcom.
These smaller manufacturers that were making games that he got to be exclusive to him, are these more like a cottage industry where you just have small groups of people working on manufacturing anything? Or is this like what we truly think as far as a factory and industry where you have an assembly line and everything being put together fairly rapidly, but you only have one line?
You know, I'd love to know the answer to that. And I wish I had the answer to that. And if any of our listeners are a little more in tune with the Japanese industry in this time or know the language and know the history better, I'd love to hear. Because this is one of those places where I have to plead ignorance, where I just don't have the sources at this time to tell that. Clearly, there were smaller manufacturers. I would say they're probably factory operations, with like just small factory operations. Certainly, I think it's a response to the many booms that are happening. There was the retail boom in the 60s, followed by the bowling fad in the late 60s, early 70s, which really got supercharged. Then there was the metal game boom following that, and then there was the video game boom first, the smaller one with Breakout and the larger one with Space Invaders. There were lots of opportunities throughout this period for additional companies to move in because the big companies, as big as they were, just couldn't fill all the demand because the whole market was so overheated and growing so rapidly. When I say smaller companies, I don't actually know who these smaller companies are and what their operations were like and how it all relates. It's a great question. I just can't fully answer it.
Next victim?
All right, so that brings us through a few companies here. Another industry that some companies came out of was the jukebox business, because there was a period of flowering of the jukebox in Japan. We won't go into that business here because we've already done it through our establishment of Coin-Op and Taito and Sega episodes, but this was a business that very much was transferred from the military bases. It started out with jukeboxes being imported in for use at military bases and then entering the local economy through secondhand reselling and refurbishment. And then companies like Taito and especially Sega back in the 60s were really dominating this business, which of course by then moved on from being a secondhand business to being an importing of first-run jukeboxes from the major American companies, Wurlitzer, Seeburg, AMI, and Rockola. That's where a lot of that business got started, but we do have a couple of our entrepreneurs that did kind of get in the video game business through a jukebox lens. Our next two people that we want to talk about both entered through jukeboxes and even more specifically ended up establishing their own companies for jukebox repair. The first of these individuals is a gentleman by the name of Kazuo Okada. Okada grew up poor and fatherless after World War II, a story I'm sure of many Japanese children of the period. But he was very smart, showed technical aptitude, and had a great work ethic. He was able to overcome these disadvantages to gain entry into a Japanese technical college. I'm not sure which one. The profile I have just says he gained entry into a Japanese technical college. While he was there, he paid particular attention to vacuum tubes. According to Okada, in 1963, so kind of the same period, it's not a coincidence all of these people are getting involved in the 60s, because you've kind of got the retail boom going on and you have the bowling boom just starting to take off as well. So there is a rapid expansion of locations in this time period in which coin-operated amusements could be placed. In 1963, according to Okada, he discovered an old jukebox in a trash pile that was just discarded because it no longer worked, but he realized that because he knew so much about vacuum tubes, he would actually be able to repair this machine. That got him realizing that he could, in fact, be a jukebox repairman. So that's what he did. He established a business just to repair jukeboxes. He ran that business for about 6 years and saved himself up about 20 million yen in that time, which was pretty good amount. He was doing pretty good. As with so many of these people that start out in one aspect of the business, once they get some money, they want to get where the real money is and start being an operator as well. So in 1967, he moved from just repairing jukeboxes to installing and operating jukeboxes on location as well. As that business continued to do okay, in 1969, he founded the Universal Lease Company, which would be his vehicle. This is the important company that he founded. Nothing to do with Universal Studios, but the Universal Lease Company. In July 1970, he moved up the chain again. He didn't get rid of the operating business, I don't think, but he decided to start a manufacturing division and get into the pachinko business, the exact same time that Tsujimoto is getting into the pachinko business. I mean, we can see all of these people are kind of chasing the same trends in society. That didn't go so well. It turned out that he had no idea what he was doing, and within 2 years, he had no money left. Because he was in a business that was considered very shady, it was considered very shady in Japan as it was in the United States, there were no banks that were willing to give him money. One aspect always of the Japanese coin-op industry, and probably a lot of other industries as well, is there's a very collectivist mentality in it, which makes sense when you think of Eastern culture. So companies in that business have always looked after each other. So even though he couldn't get anyone to lend him money, some other manufacturers in the business did extend him credit, give him loans, so that he could kind of recover from this situation. He got his big break, pun intended, I suppose, after Breakout hit, which of course was being brought in by Namco, which was Atari's representative, as we talk about in our Namco episode. One of his contacts, a jukebox vendor named Takeshi Miyajima, asked Okada to manufacture his own Breakout clone that Miyajima could sell. Okada did that. Universal released Scratch in early 1977, so I guess we are talking about 1 or 2 video games here, which was, if not the first Breakout clone to arrive after Breakout, certainly the first kind of big one, and had a massive hit in that thing. Then they were in video games, especially pachinko ever since. I mean, they rode the video game wave for a while, Mr. Do being one of their most notable video games. They kind of pivoted away from that to fully focus on the pachinko business in the 1980s as the Japanese coin-op industry was changing in ways we've discussed in other episodes. So they definitely became more of a pachinko company as time went on than a video game company. Nonetheless, they were an important company during the so-called golden age of arcade games, and that is the story of their founder, Kazuo Okada. So that does bring us to our good friends at Konami. This is the story that I wanted to tell because I found this new information about Kagemasa Kozuki, the founder of the company, that we did not have before. Therefore, I'm very excited to get into a little more depth on this than we could do in our Konami episode. Kagemasa Kozuki, just like what would become one of his biggest rivals of the business, Kinzo Tsujimoto, was born in 1940. Similar to his fellow jukebox man, Kazuo Okada, he did lose a parent. His father died in 1945, right at the end of World War II. Kozuki was one of 6 children. He was the 5th of the 6 children, to be exact, but he was also the oldest male child, the oldest son, which meant something in Japanese culture. It would have been very easy, I think, probably for his mother to be like, I've got this huge family. I need a man in the house. I can't spare you. But his mother was very insistent that he get a good education. She wanted to make sure that he'd be able to make something of himself. He ended up enrolling in a technical high school. So a high school with a focus on science and technology curriculum, because he figured that that would be a great way to find employment after school.
Now, for those who might not know, the way school is structured in Japan is very different than how it's structured in the United States and elsewhere in the world.
Absolutely. But he wasn't just interested in technical subjects as well. He actually was a bit of a dreamer. Of course, Japanese high schools, another way that they're not different from American high schools, because American high schools have extracurricular activities too, but they have, as anyone who has played a Persona game knows, they have after-school clubs that are taken very seriously. I mean, it's obviously American schools and other places have after-school clubs too, but it feels like, at least if my playing of Japanese video games has anything to say about it, which is probably doesn't, it probably means I'm just getting ridiculous stereotypes that only barely resemble reality. Everyone kind of needs to join a club or two and be involved, and it's a very serious part of your high school experience after class. He actually founded his school's literature club. He loved film, he loved literature, so he was both kind of left-brained and right-brained in that sense, so to speak. So after he graduated high school, that technical school education really did pay off, and he ended up joining a Sony service center where he would repair Sony equipment, mostly transistor radios, which were very popular and which Sony was introducing at that time. He was very good at this work and was promoted to the section chief in his service center within a short period of time. After doing this work for about 3 years, he came across an advertisement for a university correspondence course and enrolled. He loved the experience. It was just a single correspondence course. It wasn't like getting a full university education, but he loved the experience. He realized he had so much more to learn. He actually took a 1-month leave of absence to take more courses, some on an actual college campus at Keio University, stayed in the dorms there, and really enjoyed that experience. I think at that point he would have probably chucked it all to go back to college if he could, but I mean, he still needed to make a living. He couldn't just quit his job at Sony and become a full-time student. However, he did discover from friends that he made during this period that there was such a thing as night school at colleges. He enrolled in night school at Kansai University and studied economics, finally graduating in 1966. So when he was 26 years old, he got himself a college degree. Of course, he was working at Sony this entire time as well. He already had a job. Right before he graduated from school, someone he knew invited him to leave Sony and come work at the Osaka branch of Nippon Columbia Records. Nippon Columbia was trying to break into the jukebox business in Japan, which in this period in the 60s had become very popular. So he was placed in charge of that business at Nippon Columbia as a salesman. The market ended up not materializing the way that Nippon Columbia had hoped. And of course, there were already established players in that market like Sega and Taito. So it wasn't long before Nippon Columbia got out of the jukebox business. That didn't go too well, but of course they had put jukeboxes out there, and they didn't just want to abandon them entirely, or it wouldn't have been good if they had been abandoned entirely. So in March 1969, Kozuki left Nippon Columbia and established his own jukebox repair business and support business to service those Nippon Columbia jukeboxes that were already in the field. Like so many of these people, he wasn't really planning to get involved in the coin-operated amusements business, but now he's fully sucked in to the jukebox business. So through this repair business, he's getting to know operators out in the field because he's going out to their establishments in entertainment districts, bars, and other places to repair their jukeboxes. He's starting to learn from these people that they want games now, too, that they don't just want jukeboxes, they also want games. It may be that at this point he may be leasing these jukeboxes as well. I know a lot of timelines of Konami say that he had a leasing and repair business. So it's very possible by this time he's operating as well, because his clients were saying, you know, the jukebox that you're servicing for us is great, but we need more than that. We need games. People want games these days.
You need games to play with your music.
Yes. He actually made his own small game machine. He made it himself, because he does have some technical aptitude. The article that I saw said that it was modeled after pinball, but I don't know exactly what it was. And it's quite possible, you know, with the language, that pachinko was often called pinball, and they often called pinball machines flippers. So for all I know, it was modeled after a pachinko machine rather than what we would think of as a pinball machine. I don't have the details, but either way, he created a small game, and it sold really, really well. Based on that experience, in 1973, he joined together with two other people who I starting to think came in at this time now instead of 1969. In my book and in the past, I've said they came in 1969, but I kind of suspect they came in 1973 now. He joined with two co-workers from his Nippon Columbia days, Tatsuo Miyasako, who was in charge of record supply at the Osaka branch of Nippon Columbia, and Yoshinobu Naka, who worked in a local record store, to establish Konami Industry Company in 1973 with, as we said in our Konami episode, that name Konami coming from the first syllable of each of their names. Ko for Kazuki, Na for Naka, and Mi for Miyasako. I don't think they were with him in 1969 now. I think this was probably in 73.
What's your evidence for that? What makes you go, I doubt this now?
Well, because based on the new articles I found, I'm pretty sure Konami wasn't founded until 1973. I'm pretty sure that his jukebox rental and repair business was separate from that. I don't know that he would have needed co-founders like that in order to do this jukebox repair business. It seems like it was his handyman business. It would make sense that he would need to bring in partners when he was establishing this more robust incorporated manufacturing company. That's why I'm starting to think that they weren't involved until 73. Either way, those are the founders of Konami, but the main driver was always Kagemasa Kozuki. And of course, they moved from there into metal games and then into video games during the breakout boom, and the rest is history. But that's a lot more of the background. I didn't have any of that background on Kozuki's childhood. I had no idea that he did that work for Sony. I didn't know the circumstances around him coming to Nippon Columbia or leaving Nippon Columbia. I knew he was there, but I didn't know all the details about it. So that's a lot more information than we had before about our good friend Kagemasa Kozuki. So I guess at this point, there's only one other company I want to talk about, because it's another company that, like Konami, I found out a lot of information about that I didn't used to have. In fact, I had virtually no information about this company, and the information that I did have about the company didn't even make sense to me, because there was talk about there being multiple companies involved in multiple businesses, and how does that even work? That can't be right, and what's going on here? Through people at Gaming Alexandria, I have since come into possession of an interview in a Japanese coin mag with a interview with one of the key early employees at this company, or really a testimonial rather than an interview, because it's not mostly an interview format. That has finally given me the information that I need to discuss this company in some detail. The company that I am referring to is Tehkan, which would then change its name to Tecmo. So we're going to spend the rest of the episode here discussing the founding of Tecmo, which is all brand new information, and some of this, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, is in English for the first time. Not quite all of it, but a good chunk of it. Tecmo is a little different from all of these other companies because they got involved in the coin-op business at around the same time that all of these other people were in the late 60s, early 70s. But unlike all of the others, they didn't get into making games themselves until the 1980s. They didn't get involved during the breakout boom. They didn't get involved during the Space Invaders boom in creating games, but they were present throughout those periods. So we're going to kind of talk about their history pre-making video games, but they're still heavily involved in the industry for that entire time. Tehkan, later Tecmo, was founded by a gentleman by the name of Yoshihito Kakihara. Kakihara's background was in finance, not in amusements. He worked at a company by the name of Daiwa Securities. He was kind of a salesman there. I don't know exactly what he was selling, probably securities. He was in sales there, and he was very good at that job, and eventually decided that he wanted to become an entrepreneur, become an independent businessman. So he left Daiwa in July of 1967 and founded a company called the Nippon Yacht Company, which was a sales company to handle the sales of small yachts being created by a Japanese yacht designer by the name of Tokihiro Kumazawa. Again, in the late 1960s here, this is a time when the economy is doing well, where people are having more and more leisure time, where people are having more and more disposable income. Kakihara was under the impression that they were entering a new period, a new leisure era, as he called it, in Japan, where leisure goods and luxury goods were going to be in some demand, and so he found himself a niche here and got to work, essentially. At roughly the same time, he ended up taking over the family business, because it turns out there was also a family business called Taikoku Kansai, which was a cleaning company. Janitorial company, essentially. They would go into offices and places like that, and they would polish the floors, and they would wipe stuff down. They would clean places. His father had established that business in 1964, and Yoshihito took it over at roughly the same time in 1967. That was one of the things that really confused me, because there are corporate timelines of Tecmo, and those corporate timelines always say that in September 1964, Taikoku Kansai was established as a building maintenance company, and then in July 1967, Nippon Yacht Company was founded to sell yachts. And it's like, what the heck do these two companies have to do with each other, and why are there two companies like this? It makes no sense, and it was very confusing.
You need really, really clean yachts?
Right, but the reason for that, thankfully finding this article is what made it make sense. Because the Nippon Yacht Company was his company, and then he ended up taking over his father's company. My guess is he wasn't initially planning to take over his father's company too. That explains why he has two companies, because one had been his father's company that he took over, and the other was his company that he had founded when he decided to leave Daiwa Securities. That makes sense now, why there are two companies that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. The cleaning company is a small company. He doesn't have employees. He doesn't have employees at either company. He is literally doing both of these businesses himself. I'm sure the yacht business probably doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, take up as much of his time, because it's kind of a boutique business. It's this one yacht designer that he's representing. There aren't that many people running around buying yachts, but of course yachts are very expensive, so just selling one yacht puts you in a pretty good place, the commission on that. I assume the yacht business wasn't taking up too much of his time, but he was doing the cleaning business himself. He was actually going around doing all of the cleaning.
That can take a lot out of you.
Yeah. He didn't even have his own office for these companies. He was borrowing space in a rooftop warehouse that was owned by one of his cleaning company's clients. He doesn't have a real office. He doesn't have any employees. He's selling yachts and cleaning buildings all by himself. The time that he decided that this just had to change was, I don't know the year, but it was probably New Year's Eve 1966, but I don't know the year for sure. He had a cleaning job about 7 to 8 kilometers away from his office. He has nothing. He doesn't even have a company car or truck. So he's using taxis and stuff to get around to these places he's cleaning. On this night, he could not get a taxi to save his life. So he walked with a floor polisher for about 7 to 8 kilometers.
Oh dear. And you don't have that thing on, so it's not using some of its own momentum to help propel itself. He's more or less dragging or pushing that thing.
in winter.
Oh, winter.
I know this sounds like one of these stories of like, back in my day, I used to walk to school uphill both ways, 5 miles in the snow. I know it sounds like that.
Pushing a polisher.
But this is a true story. Experiences like that, and the fact that the yacht business wasn't going so well either, made him realize that he needed a change, that he could not keep this up.
I can only imagine the toll on his body.
For real. Sometime, and I don't have the exact date again, but based on the history of the company, probably in 1969, around there, he was out on one of his cleaning jobs at a bowling alley. And this is right in the period of time when the bowling fad is really getting hot in Japan. Bowling alleys are taking over, and coin-operated amusements are not far behind. There are gun corners going into all the bowling alleys. Usually they're being operated not by the bowling alley themselves, but by a contractor from the coin-op business, from the coin-op industry. He's in this bowling alley, and he notices the operator of the gun corner of the coin-op space struggling to carry, at least, this heavy bag of coins that he has just collected from all the machines in the bowling alley. So he ends up, I guess, talking to the guy or something, because he learns that that huge bag of coins that he can barely carry represented a single week's earnings.
Yeah, you see that. That's probably going to get you to go, I'm pushing this polisher up and down slick roads when I could just be hauling a bag full of cash with a $sign on it, taking it to my local bank.
Well, a yen sign in this case, but otherwise, absolutely, that is the way of things. So he pretty quickly decides that it is time to get out of the cleaning business and get out of the luxury yacht business. Bonus points if you get that very obscure reference. You won't, and it's okay. And start managing gun corners, game corners, whatever you want to call them, in bowling alleys and other establishments. So in March 1970, he opens his first bowling alley, gun corner, game corner, with machines purchased from Sega Enterprises. And he is now officially in the coin-op business. Kakihara is a pretty smart guy. I mean, he had worked for a securities company, and he was very good in that business. To be good at a securities company, you have to be pretty good at recognizing trends, and you have to be able to recognize when things are getting hot, and you also have to be able to recognize when things are becoming no longer hot. Those are important skills to have in something like the coin-operated amusement business, where there are lots of fads. The success that Taikoku Kansai really has in this operating business is kind of having a sense of when to get into new areas and when to get out. One thing is, I don't know where he got all of his capital from, if it's just that he invested what little profits he had from the other businesses, but he never bought games on credit. He was always able to pay for his games outright, right up front, which means that he was never carrying a lot of debt, and if he had to walk away from various aspects of the coin-op business, he could do so relatively easily because he wasn't on the hook for anything. When the bowling boom collapsed, he kind of saw that collapse coming and was already pulling out in the bowling business, but even so, the collapse of the bowling alleys didn't hurt him because, okay, so some of the bowling alleys he had machines in closed and he couldn't operate those machines anymore. Well, those machines were already paid off. He didn't have any debt he was carrying on those machines. Yeah, it sucks that there's less revenue coming in, but he also was relatively debt-free, which meant that he could weather less revenue coming in for a time because there were no immediate crises coming out of that. The bowling alley business went well for several years. Bowling alleys peaked in 1972. That was when they really hit their top. And at that time, Taikoku Kansai was operating in roughly 60 locations and just making an absolute killing. They didn't successfully capture every trend. They missed air hockey and they missed video games. They didn't start investing heavily in the early air hockey and the early video games. But on the whole, he was able to figure out trends in the business and keep things going. He didn't catch every trend, but he was pretty good at figuring out when kind of the broad strokes of the business were starting and stopping. So as the bowling boom wound down, he was able to exit that relatively well. And he even took advantage of the kind of transition from the bowling markets to the metal game centers and the new locations by not only operating, but like some of these other players like Kenzo Tsujimoto and even Masaya Nakamura, for example, started not just being an operator, but also being a reseller. So he would take his machines that he was no longer using or buy additional machines that he didn't need and then resell them to other operators for profit. That was clearly a common thing for companies that aspired to move from operating into something greater, because we've seen Nakamura do it, we've seen Tsujimoto do it, now we're seeing Kakihara do it at Taikoku Kansai. So in 1973, they created a sales division so that they could also sell equipment. They're not manufacturing. What he did is he did a lot of reselling. He got some literature from the Japan Amusement Association, the JAA, which was one of the forerunners of JAMA, and got a visitor list from their trade show of all the operators that had come to the show. And then he started visiting those operators, bought machines that they no longer needed, and then resold them on to other people. And I think he was probably able to do this in this time period because, like I said, he was debt-free. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of these operators had bought on credit, so still owed money on the machines, because that was pretty standard in the business. With the bowling fad dying down and bowling alleys closing, I imagine some of these people were a little worried. They're like, we're losing locations, we have no place to put these machines, and we haven't paid them off yet. So in comes Kakihara, who's like, you have machines you don't need? I can buy them from you. I imagine that they were really happy to see him, because that probably allowed some of them to pay off those machines that they were getting nervous about. Then Kakihara could just turn around and sell them to someone else who was still doing good business and make a profit, all while still operating, all while still buying his own machines without going into debt. So he's got a pretty good thing going here in early 1970s. Of course, then, after the bowling alleys fall out, the metal game parlors come in, as we talked about with some of our other entrepreneurs. So he was ready to dive into that business as well. In 1976, he opened his first metal game center, started getting heavily involved in that business, and started expanding into other arcades as well, just really becoming bigger and bigger in that side of the business. In 1977, changed the name of the company to Tehkan, which is the name that it would enter the video game business under. It didn't change its name to Tecmo until 1986. Then they made even more money off of the invader boom, because they've already got this reseller business going. They've already got this great cash flow going. They're already able to buy machines up front. They're not buying them, as I said, on debt. So they just went out and started buying all of the invader games they possibly could, putting them on location, selling them to other people, making all sorts of money. Eventually, in 1981, after all of this activity, they finally decide to start getting into video games themselves. So even though they weren't making Space Invaders and they weren't making Breakout, they were a big part of the Space Invaders boom, and they made a lot of money that eventually finally leapfrogged them into manufacturing, as Tehkan later changed to Tecmo. The rest is history, Jeffrey, because we're not going to talk about how these companies progressed, certainly not right now. But this episode hopefully gave everyone a little better understanding of the types of entrepreneurs that were getting involved in this Japanese video game business in the early days, the kind of similarities and the kind of businesses they were coming out of in the way that they were expanding their businesses once they got in, slowly expanding in general from operating up to distributing, up to manufacturing, and coming to be some of the cornerstones of the Japanese video game industry.
Many important stories, many interesting stories, and a lot of very good information to sink your teeth into. And hopefully you can eventually find more in-depth information so that we can actually do each of these companies their due and really expand upon each of them more deeply.
Absolutely.
So, do we stay in Japan with our next episode, or do we move on to somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose we should probably move on to someplace else. We try to keep things a little fluid. We never try to stay in one geographic area, one segment of the business too long. So it is probably time for us to move on to another area. I think that a good place to move would be back to the United States and the U.S. computer game, and later on, I suppose, console game industry as well. Take another in-depth look at a game creator, this time one Jordan Mechner. We've talked about some of Jordan Mechner's games here and there when talking about fighting games or Broderbund or other topics, but we haven't done an in-depth look at the man himself, who had a fascinating career, and also, through much of his career in the 80s, kept detailed journals that he then published later on that give a lot of insight not just into what he was working on, but what he was thinking about during that time period. So he's an interesting fellow that there's a lot of information on, and I think we could do a good episode there.
Wow, 2 biographies in as many episodes.
Well, more than 2, because we did like 5 in this one, but this will be a full look at his time in the game industry as opposed to a focus on entrepreneurs founding companies.
Very true. So we will see you next time as we explore the Mechnerverse on They Create World. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworld.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create World, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworld. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Back to Your Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under Creative Commons Attribution License.